Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 4, Swarm. Jen followed Ethan's bike out of Bellwood into the next town over. If she'd known this was where they'd gone, she'd have come to visit. Maybe she could have prevented this whole mess. She shook her head. She couldn't afford to gamble with maybes. In her line of work, that train of thought could break someone. They pulled up to the back street of an old run-down building. It might have been a house at one point, repurposed into smaller apartments. The windows were broken in and the door was busted. Ethan stepped off his bike and set his helmet down on the seat. Jen followed his lead. "Lovely neighborhood," Jen commented, glancing around at the trash in the gutters and the broken glass on the sidewalk. Ethan's smile was tight and forced as he led her up the stairs of the vandalized building. There was graffiti here and there, some of it only half finished.
"We didn't live here. Had a little apartment further into town. Still not the best neighborhood, but people didn't usually throw rocks through the windows. But Dad came here all the time. Eventually he stopped coming home at all. A few weeks ago I came by to check on him, and he was gone."
Jen nodded as she followed him. The inside of the building was in worse shape than the outside. There were holes in the walls, and the floor creaked ominously. Jen thought she spotted a bug or two crawling through the darkness. She was reasonably certain this place had been condemned when Victor Validus had decided to do whatever he'd been doing here. The main room was empty. All the graffiti here was older, more faded, and slightly dusty. It was full of tables and empty boxes. Ethan frowned but kept going, making his way to the back room. This one was plastered wall to wall in notes, papers strewn across every flat surface. Jen frowned as she shifted through some of them. Ethan was looking around.
"This is where I found those chips and canisters. They were everywhere."
Jen shook her head as she shifted through another stack of papers. This one looked fresher than the others, less creased paper and no dust, unlike some of the stacks. "Looks like your dad had business with Ship It." She pulled a shipping receipt off the top of the pile and glanced at the date. Her expression slipped into something slightly darker, and she folded the paper and stuck it in her pocket. "Any idea what where he might have been sending those chips?" Ethan shook his head. Jen stepped closer to him. "Whoever took your dad wanted these chips." Jen's eyes narrowed in thought. "The freak from the drop. The guy in the trench coat. Any idea who he was?"
"No clue."
Jen wasn't so sure she believed him, though. There was conviction in his voice, but his eyes flickered away from hers at the last second. She shook her head, turning back to the paperwork. A lot of it was handwritten on whatever paper Victor could have gotten his hands on. Everything from notebook paper to cardstock to flyers from the street littered the desk and floor. Strangely, though, the Ship It receipts remained free from the scribbling, and there were a lot of them. Jen picked up an old flyer. Drawn on it was a detailed specification of the chips, notes all over the edges of the paper. "Check it out. Your dad wasn't just studying the chips, he was developing them, upgrading them. Ethan, I hate to break it to you, but your dad was working on his way to crazy."
"He's not crazy, he's just possessed by his work."
Jen shook her head, not taking Ethan's hint. He was terrified to tell her the truth, that the man in the trench coat from the drop had at one point been his father. He'd also more than likely been tracking the chips Ethan had stolen from this very room. "Why, though?" Jen asked, still looking over the notes. Ethan shook his head.
"I wish I knew."
They were interrupted as the door they'd come in from opened. Several people stepped into the room. Jen was starting to think her face was going to be stuck in a permanent frown. The group was odd. Leading the way was a little girl with blonde hair and pigtails, loosely clutching a purple bunny doll. Next to her was an older man in a business suit. On the other side was an older woman with dark skin and a hairnet. A teen in punk clothes and a boy in a sweater vest stood at the back of the group. Jen could see a few more figures in the room behind them. There would be no escape that way. "May we help you?" Probably the scariest thing about that question was that they had all spoken at the same time, a mechanical edge to every voice. "No, we're fine, just browsing." The group shifted forward, and an orange light flickered in their eyes. Jen swore under her breath. Ethan stepped closer to her, away from the people. "Check out their eyes. Something's not right." Ethan pointed the desk light at the slowly advancing crowd. He pointed at the punk girl's neck, and Jen spotted what he was looking at immediately.
"It's not just their eyes, it's the chips. They're being controlled.
Ethan was right. Jen could see one of the chips crawling just under the skin of the punk girl's neck. Ethan himself was starting to believe that this was a nightmare brought to life. First his father had fallen to the chips, now others were becoming victims too.
You will come with us. The Queen will want to meet you.
Jen stepped back slightly as the infected people continued their advance. I'd love to do that, but all that curtsying just really isn't my style. Several more people stepped into the room, still looking like a group that had been randomly selected off the streets. There's too many of them. Like they knew we were coming, like this is a trap. Ethan shook his head frantically. I swear it's not, Ethan trailed off. As Jen yanked him out of the way of one of the drones, she spun the dial on the Omnitrix. We could really use some help here. But the display was yellow, and the silhouette was wavering as if incomplete. From a static squiggle? Fantastic. She glanced around and spotted a side exit. She grabbed Ethan's hand and took off for the door, only to find one of the drones reaching for her when she opened it. Jen! But if Grandpa Max had taught his granddaughters anything, it was how to defend themselves. Jen lashed out, planting a solid kick to the man's chest, sending him tumbling over the railing of the stairs. She felt a twinge of guilt as they raced down the rusty metal stairs, but it vanished as he got back to his feet and kept coming after them. They reached their bikes, only to find them surrounded. Jen thought fast. She and Asmith had talked about the Omnitrix at length during the week-long trip to restore the 24 worlds laid to waste by the Highbreed. He mostly insisted on letting her work out the workings of the watch on her own, but he had let her in on a few things. The yellow setting meant the watch was in scanning mode, a new DNA sample present. That had happened twice before, once with an alien that bore a striking resemblance to an ancient Egyptian mummy, and once with a Frankenstein-like alien. It was happening again now.
What do we do?
Ethan asked, panic sinking into his voice. Jen spun the dial on the Omnitrix, fiddling with it for a moment, before she slapped the dial back down. This time she didn't transform, though. Instead, a wave of energy shot out of the watch, slamming into the people advancing on them, sending them flying. Let's go! Jen shouted, slamming her helmet on her head and straddling her bike as people began to pull themselves back to their feet. Their escape would have been perfect if it hadn't been for the other drones around the corner. Jen managed to dodge them, but Ethan was forced to spin his bike around and head back towards the broken-down house. One of the drones lunged at him, and he ducked, overbalancing his bike and sending him crashing to the ground, his bike spinning away from him, sending sparks flying. Sure this was the end, he squeezed his eyes shut before the revving of an engine made him snap them back open. Jen was maneuvering through the drones like a pro biker on an obstacle course. Get on, she called out, and she spun the bike. He leapt on behind her, rising to deck one of the drones that was reaching for her. He had to grab hold of her, as she kicked a switch on the bike and it took off at speeds that he knew weren't street legal. By the time she slowed, they were nearly 2 miles away. She pulled off the road and flipped up her visor. She glanced back at him. You okay? Ethan realized at that moment that not only was he still holding on to her around the waist, but he was shaking almost violently. He nodded, but didn't put up his own visor. Fine. She quirked an eyebrow at him. It's okay not to be okay. Ethan let out a ragged breath and pulled off his helmet. It suddenly felt much too confining. Jen pulled her own helmet off and didn't flinch as Ethan wrapped his arms a bit tighter around her and buried his head in her shoulder, letting himself shake for a moment. He pulled himself back together after a minute and sat up straight, letting go of her and scrubbing at his eyes with his jacket, letting out a deep breath. Sorry. Jen shook her head at him. No need to be sorry. This is a lot to handle. He nodded and cleared his throat. How'd you do that energy blast thing? Jen glanced down at the Omnitrix. Well, it was an overdrive to scan the chips. I'd redirected the energy of the scan back out at the chips. I wasn't sure if it would work, honestly. It's very touchy, she said, waving her wrist. He laughed slightly. What do we do now? Jen reached into her pocket and pulled out the slip from Ship It. We head to the Ship It Center and see if we can't find what your dad was sending. Maybe even find him. Ethan frowned at that. Whatever he sent is probably long gone. Jen shook her head, pointing at the date on the slip. This is dated today, in the same writing from the notes on the chips. Ethan's frown grew deeper. Jen honestly didn't look much happier. You said he disappeared weeks ago. He did. Ethan wasn't exactly lying. It had been weeks since the Thing had taken over, since he'd seen his father in familiar eyes instead of an ominous orange light.
You believe me, right?
I believe we'll find something at the Ship-It, Jen said, choosing her words carefully. She pulled her helmet back on. Ethan frowned and followed her lead. He had to hold on to her as they pulled back out into the night street, but this time it felt a bit awkward. Kevin and Gwen had quite the eventful day. They'd managed to break into Max's private files on Victor Validus and weren't quite pleased with what they found. The doctor had been frantic during his interrogation by Max, begging his teacher to understand that he'd been trying to save the world from the chips. But Max was having none of it. Gwen hadn't seen him like this since an old artifact had surfaced during the crazy summer when Jen found the Omnitrix. Max's attitude had almost gotten both of his granddaughters killed by Forever Knights before he snapped out of it. Kevin had also managed to track the chips to a Ship-It center in the next town over, so they'd gone to investigate, both silently agreeing that maybe Jen was right about this and Max's prejudice at even the perceived betrayal of his prized pupil was blinding him. Now they were racing away from swarms of the chips that were now formed into spiky balls of doom. It was right at that moment Kevin missed the usual sarcastic quip from the back seat. Jen and Ethan had pulled over again, this time to look up directions, but a revving drew Jen's attention.
What is that?
Ethan asked as the sound grew louder. Only the world's most obnoxious muscle car? Come on, we're taking a detour. Jen kicked the bike into high gear and they sped off. When they pulled up to a vacant lot that Jen had last heard the sound of revving and rending metal from, they found the green and black car flipped and two figures standing staring at a large ball of black spikes that was slowly advancing. Jen took one hand off the handlebars and yanked her helmet off before tossing it to the side and spinning the dial on the Omnitrix. Before Ethan could ask what she was doing, she shouted over the sound of the bike's engine, "Take over!"
Are you crazy?
She must have been, though, because she leapt up onto the seat of the bike, forcing Ethan to grab the handlebars or crash. She didn't stay that way long, though. She jumped from the bike and slapped the Omnitrix in one fluid motion. When she landed, she was on her feet, fully transformed into a giant dinosaur-like alien, roaring out its own name as Kevin and Gwen, the two figures they'd spotted in the lot, relaxed slightly.
You know, I talk a lot of shit about your cousin, but her timing is impeccable.
Kevin stated as they raced away from the mass of chips, meeting up with Ethan behind what remained of an old concrete wall. Jen roared again and lunged at the deadly ball of chips. The battle didn't seem to be going all that well. A large spinning vortex made of spiked rings heading for Humongosaur, so she picked up the only weapon available to her. It just so happened to be the remains of Kevin's car.
Don't you dare!
Kevin screamed as Gwen grabbed him to keep him from interfering.
Don't you do it, Tennyson!
But Jen either didn't hear him over the whirring of the chips or didn't care because she swung the wreck like she was a batter at the World Series. The explosion was like fireworks, and Kevin grabbed both Ethan and Gwen and shoved them both to the ground as a large piece of metal flew over them. He scrambled to his feet, swearing up a storm.
Oh, I'm gonna kill you, Tennyson!
He shouted as he got a good look at the carnage around them. The only piece of the car still miraculously intact was the engine block and a few small chunks of green and black cast iron. But it seemed to have had the desired effects. The chips were no longer swarming, though a few of them still seemed to flicker slightly. Kevin kicked one of the piles of dead chips as Jen stepped over to them, in a flash of green going from gigantic dino alien to her usual 5-foot form. Sorry, Kev, but would you rather I let you die? He just glared at her. What are you guys doing here anyway? We managed to track the chips to a Ship-It center not far from here, Gwen answered as her boyfriend stalked away, pulling out his phone as he did. Ethan and Jen showed a look, but Gwen kept talking. By the time we got there, they were already gone, but they'd taken over the clerk, turned him into some kind of mind-controlled drone? Jen asked, and Gwen nodded as Kevin crouched over his engine block. He was now on the phone with someone, but all Jen caught was something about a toe. Yeah, how'd you know that? We just ran into his extended family. Ethan nodded. He'd stepped to the side to retrieve Jen's helmet, only slightly scuffed. He handed it back to her as the cousins began to argue about if he was coming with them or not. He's coming, that's final. He's in too much danger on his own now. There was an authority in Jen's voice that called a halt to the conversation. She scooped up a few of the still sparking chips. We need to get these back to the hole for analysis. At least Grandpa will believe us now. We don't have time to argue. This is a way bigger problem than we thought it was, and much more widespread. She slipped the chips into her jacket pocket and zipped it closed. She pulled her helmet back on. We'll meet you there. Ethan stepped over to Kevin and handed him a business card. Cab service, he stated when Kevin shot him a questioning look. The taller boy glared. Thanks, boy toy, but Ed's got a truck in the area. They're already on their way to get us. He's not my boy toy, Kevin. Jen shot at him from the bike. Kevin shook his head, and Gwen couldn't help but agree with her boyfriend as Ethan got on the bike behind Jen and wrapped his arms around her. They took off back towards Bellwood as a truck bearing Ed's logo pulled into the lot. Chapter 5. Busted. Max didn't panic often. When Vilgax had taken Jen back when she was 10, he'd panicked. When he realized that the final battle with the Highbreed was going on back on Earth, thanks to a man in a lab coat who'd appeared out of nowhere in the null void, he'd panicked. But usually his panic manifested as a kind of battle calm, years of practice paying off. It usually had him on edge for days after, but he kept it together during the crisis. Right now, he was starting to panic again. He was receiving reports from every plumber stationed across the world, retired or not, reporting appearances of the chips Validus had stolen. And now his best team was AWOL. He had the rookies running double patrols, but Gwen and Kevin had vanished, hopefully chasing Jen. But to his surprise, Jen showed back up first, and she wasn't alone. Grandpa Max, he cut her off. We'll talk later. And he pointed to Ethan, stays in the brig. We have bigger problems. The chips are active and taking people over. Max's eyes narrowed at Ethan as Jen spoke. He tell you that? Max's question sounded like an accusation. Jen rolled her eyes, but before she could get really upset at her grandfather, backup arrived. She's right. It was Gwen. The chips Validus took have become active. Very active. Kevin spat, glaring at Jen like he was planning her demise for what she'd done to his car, which was a possibility. Jen ignored him and pulled on a heavy-duty glove before unzipping her pocket and pulling out the chips she brought with her, trapping them in a petri dish. Max couldn't believe what he was seeing. The girls were right. The chips were active. Tiny legs had sprouted from them, and the one he was examining kept trying to scuttle out of the tweezers he was using to safely handle it. This shouldn't be possible. They were dead tech. Your father's tinkering must have done this. Jen was about to leap to Ethan's defense when Gwen piped up. There's another possibility, actually. Kevin brought it up. What if the chips are like a species of insect? They could lay dormant for years at a time. Jen raised an eyebrow. Kevin brought that up. He's been watching the Science Channel. Gwen sounded almost proud. Jen nodded. So the question becomes how to take down an insect colony. They were silent for a moment, then Ethan and Gwen spoke at the same time. The Queen! Gwen glanced at Ethan, and he took that as permission to keep talking. The people who attacked us, the people being controlled, they talked about the Queen. Yeah, us too, Kevin said, and Gwen nodded. So, we find the Queen, we take her down. The Queen dies, the Hive dies. Max nodded at Jen. Alright, Kevin, get on a tracker. Already done. Easier to track the live chips anyway. Kevin hit a button and the computer began displaying the chips, making everyone's heart sink. They were showing up all over the world in every major city. Target is experiencing exponential growth. The computer commented as if they couldn't all see that. Shit, that's no 100-mile radius. Kevin swore. Max put the chip he'd been examining away and took charge. Kevin, see if you can find a way to deal with those drones without killing them. Gwen, work on disrupting the connection between the chip and the hosts. Jen, it's gonna be like finding a needle in a haystack tracking the Queen down. Get on it. And Ethan, the air grew tense. Since you're here, you'll help. I don't want him going 2 feet without an escort. I'm gonna go analyze these chips we have. I'll be in my office. He didn't feel the chip crawling up his arm as he walked away. Kevin had passed out into his keyboard about 10 minutes ago. Gwen didn't look too far behind. Jen tapped her cousin on the shoulder. Won't do anyone any good if you pass out. I'll wake you in an hour.
You better.
The redhead laid her head down on the desk in front of her and was out like a light. Jen turned to Ethan. You should catch some shut-eye, too. Ethan shook his head.
I'll sleep when my dad's home safe.
Jen nodded. Suit yourself. Ethan frowned at his keyboard. With the other two asleep, he could ask the question that had been burning in his brain since she showed up at the diner.
Why did you decide to help me?
Jen frowned at her own keyboard. Because you didn't ask to be in this situation. I know what it's like, getting tossed into a situation you never asked to be in. She tapped the Omnitrix. I never asked for this. Now it's never going away. No one who isn't me knows what that's like. Ethan reached out and took her hand, squeezing for a moment.
I might.
She smiled at him. Jen was driving herself to frustration over the map and needed another set of eyes on it, so she left Ethan with Gwen and Kevin and set off to Max's office. When she got there, it was empty. She frowned, looking around. She picked up the Petri dish off the desk. There were 3 chips skittering around inside. That was odd. She could have sworn she brought 4. Grandpa Max, we need another set of eyes on the map. Jen heard footsteps behind her and turned, wondering why he hadn't said anything. She realized why as he brought down the computer monitor as if to hit her with it. She got both of his wrists and twisted hard, sending the monitor crashing to the floor. She really hoped that was enough to grab the attention of the others as she grappled with her grandfather. The Omnitrix had gone yellow again and chirruped, DNA analysis complete. New DNA sample acquired. That would have to wait. Drone Max was stronger than he usually was. His hands were advancing in her grip towards her throat. Snap out of it, Grandpa! It's me! It's Jen! He didn't seem to hear her. She'd never been happier to see Gwen, Kevin, and Ethan. He's infected. We need to restrain him, but be careful not to... She was interrupted when Kevin brought his fist down on Max's head. He crumpled. Hurt him! She finished indignantly.
What? He's restrained?
Kevin quipped. Jen and Gwen glared at him as the brunette knelt beside her grandfather.
Oh, give me some credit. It was rubber.
He held up his hand, still coated in rubber. Jen let out a breath. Grandpa Max would have a goose egg, but nothing worse. We need to restrain him, Jen said, careful to keep her voice steady. She heaved him up. Kevin grabbed his other arm and helped her heave him into a chair. Gwen raised a hand and cuffs made of mana materialized around his wrists and the arms of the chair. Jen began to search for restraints, knowing her cousin's emotional state affected her powers. But she never got the chance to find them. Max was already waking up. Grandpa Max, are you okay? She asked, stepping forward. Jen stuck out a hand to stop her cousin. We're fine. Why are you looking at us like that? We're great. We're going to colonize the Earth. The 4 of them stared at him.
He usually has odd jobs for us, but that's a new one,
Kevin said, desperate to break the tension in the room. It really didn't work. Grandpa, snap out of it! Gwen begged. Jen shook her head, eyes still fixed on her grandfather. That's not Grandpa right now. Max's grin was nearly inhuman. We will take over every one of you. We will eradicate humanity. You've already lost. Gwen sobbed and the energy manacles flickered. Max moved with the speed of a snake. He slapped a hand to a button under the desk and gas began to flow into the room from the vents. Gwen, shield the desk! Jen cried out between coughs. A soft glow told her Gwen had obeyed. A blow to the face told her drone Max did not like that. The crack told her her nose was broken. Not having seen the blow coming, it sent her spinning to the ground as running footsteps retreated. Gwen choked out a spell and the smoke was absorbed into a pink bubble that promptly vanished. Jen! Ethan got to her first and helped her to her feet as she clutched her still freely bleeding nose.
The hell did you have her protect the desk for?
Kevin asked as he grabbed a box of tissues from said now unshielded desk. He held a few out to Ethan, who gently held them to Jen's nose. There's more chips on the desk. 3 of them. Could have infected most of us and killed the other one. Jen said thickly. Gwen stepped forward. Hang in there, cuz. She pushed Ethan's hands out of the way and spoke in another flowing magical language. The bleeding slowed and stopped, but the nose itself remained painful and throbbing. Best I can do for now. Jen shrugged, careful not to move her face. We've got bigger things to deal with. She looked around. Grandpa knows this place better than we do. He's long gone by now. We need to find the Queen. Jen stood from the seat Ethan had guided her into after helping her to her feet. Ethan took the box of tissues from Kevin and held them out to Jen. She took a few and finished mopping up her face. Then she led the way back to the main console room. Gwen stopped and stepped into the break room. Jen followed her, grabbing both of the boys. "No more splitting up," she said by way of explanation. Ethan nodded. Gwen pulled an ice pack out of the freezer and handed it to her cousin. Jen nodded and held it to her throbbing face as they left the break room. She pointed up at the map and spoke, her voice still a little thick. "What do you notice about this map? Anything odd?" Kevin shrugged.
Colors are a bit drab. Try seafoam blue.
Jen rolled her eyes. "The chips are popping up all over the world. London, Paris, Munich, and central Missouri? That seem a little weird to anyone else?" Gwen scrubbed her eyes and Kevin wrapped an arm around her. "There are thousands of people in all of those places but one." Ethan nodded.
That part of Missouri is in the middle of nowhere.
He'd pulled his phone out.
The only thing in Barren Rock is the International Ship-It Center.
Jen nodded, letting out a low breath. "The first shipment would have been the first wave of soldiers. If this has been going on for weeks, we'd be talking total immersion by now. Santa Mira all over again."
Santa Mira?
Ethan asked. Jen waved him off. "I'll explain later." "Right, so they're taking over the world by overnight shipping, producing and shipping them out all around the world. That's actually really clever." Kevin raised an eyebrow at her. "What? As far as plans for world domination we've gone up against over the years, this one's actually clever. It's refreshing for the big bad to be smart and not just call me out for a street fight. Not a good thing, but refreshing." Kevin shook his head.
"You're a little messed up, Tennyson."
Jen shot him a dirty look. "Kevin, people have been trying to kill me since I was 10. Of course I'm a little messed up." Kevin shrugged. Jen let it slide. "Okay, so how do we get to Barren Rock? We don't have Kevin's car anymore." Kevin glared at her for that comment, then sighed and stood.
"I've got something."